Okay. Hello and good morning, everyone. I think it's time to get started. I see a lot of people are online already, so time to get going here. It's going to be an interesting event, totally new series of things we are doing, so that's going to be very, very interesting. And it's great to see a lot of people online. I'm going to have a look on my screen over here every so often to try to see questions and so on. But let's get started with the content at hand. Let me introduce myself and switch to the slides as well. My name is Markus Egger. I'm the President and Chief Software Architect of EPS Software Corporation, also known as Code Consulting, Code Magazine, Code Training, and a few other things like that. I am the publisher of Code Magazine. That, however, is kind of a secondary passion of mine, if you will. I am the founder of Code Consulting and EPS Software. That's how I spend most of my time. I do probably like most of the listeners today. I do a lot of production software development. That's what takes up 80-90% of my time. I am also an author and speaker. Speak at a lot of different events, from small meetings, online meetings, all the way up to things like larger Microsoft events. I'm a Microsoft Regional Director. I always like to make very clear what that means. Being a Regional Director means that I have a formal relationship with Microsoft. However, and this is very important, it means I'm not employed by Microsoft. So the combination of that means I get a lot of inside information that I can hopefully pass on to you. But it also means I don't have to speak Microsoft marketing speak, and I can say whatever I want. So that puts me into an interesting position to share the information that we're about to talk about here today. Now, before we get into it, we have a lot of content ahead of ourselves for an hour. So there's not going to be a lot of marketing. However, my marketing people always tell me I have to have at least one marketing slide. So here it is about EPS Software Corporation and Code Consulting. What we do as a business is we help people build better software, and that happens in a variety of ways. We do so by doing training, we do so by publishing a magazine, we do a lot of community events, but we also do a lot of actual development and help people with that, whether that's mentoring, whether that's consulting, or whether that is building a whole custom application, doing custom app dev. So that's what we do. If you have any needs along those lines, feel free to contact us. Here's a list of the things that we kind of do, but it's of course the usual, from web development, mobile development, cloud development, database development, all the way to desktop development, which is probably the more unusual aspect of our organization. So all those things we can help you with. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll actually show you how to take advantage of that, even free. We do offer an hour of free consulting to everyone who attended this event. Okay, a few other things related to this. I know a lot of people are looking for work right now, and I guess it remains to be seen how all of that develops for all of us, but we are generally looking for people. So take a look at these URLs if you're interested in a job, if you're interested in writing for Code Magazine, and also if you're interested in our staff augmentation, becoming part of our network of people that we place with other companies as well. So that might be of interest to some people too. Now, this event we try to push on social media. We'll have some follow-up things after the event on social media. You'll be able to get the whole slide deck downloaded and so on, and spread the love about this. We're going to do a whole series of events like I'll be talking about here in a moment. And so we spread that at Code Magazine on Twitter, facebook.com/Code Magazine, and so on. So if you want to write about this event, if you liked it, please feel free to share that online as well. Now here's what we're actually doing. Stater.net has been an event that has in the past sometimes been online. We used a little bit of different technology, so this is a first for us, trying to do this on YouTube with, of course, like most people around the world these days, having a little bit of a home setup. So I'm in my home right now. You may hear a dog bark, you may hear cars go by. I hope the lawnmower people are not going to show up right in the middle of this. So it's a little bit of a makeshift setup. In the past, we did a little different. So that's going to be a little bit of an experiment. We'll see how that goes. But our intention is to go forward with a series of State of .NET online events. Today is the first one. We'll focus on the core .NET topics, as would make sense if we do a series like this. There's going to be a lot of other topics coming. Next month will be Azure. The months afterwards, we have things like cognitive services, DevOps. We're going to talk about Blazor in detail and so on. And we would like to hear from you. Tell us the topics you're interested in. Stata.net is meant to be something where we talk about the world a little bit from a Microsoft angle, but that includes a lot of things these days, obviously. It includes web development, includes mobile development, all those kinds of things .NET developers should know, even if they're not truly .NET technologies as such. So that's how we approach this. So let us know what you're interested in, and we'll try to work that into the schedule. Now, it's new for us to do this as a series of online events, even though we had usually twice a year online events before. But we are going to keep doing this. So we intend to go forward with this from now on with at least a monthly event. It's going to stay like that. However, we will also continue the live events. Right now, that's not possible, obviously, but we will go back to that. We will have live events in various cities. We'll see when we can start that again. So that State of .NET tour, that was the traditional format of this event, where we go to a certain city and then have an afternoon of free information loaded with a number of topics. We'll keep doing that and continue with that as soon as possible as well. So then we'll have two things concurrently, where we do both the online event as well as the live events. Now here's what we're going to do today. Like I said, this is the first in a series of events. Since it's called the Stata.net, it makes sense to start out looking at the fundamental .NET technologies. Where are we at with .NET? How did we get here? A little bit of the history, not too much. Where are we at right now? What are the technologies you should use? And where are we going in the future? So those are the important things. I think my goal is to show you some background info, give you some information as to how to make decisions going forward, which technology should you bet on, what may not be as interesting, and the fact that I can speak freely there allows me to share information about things that may not work so well. So hopefully we can send you off in the right direction, give you the information so you can plan well into the future, make investments into the right things, and not go down the incorrect paths. We'll talk a little bit about things like the Visual Studio tools. That's going to be a very, very small part of the presentation today. I have a little more content than I can cover in the time I have. I still wanted to leave those slides in the slide deck, however, because we are going to send those slides around after the meeting as well. So that's what we're here to talk about. Now, you can online. I'm going to look over here every so often, and I'm going to look at questions that are going to be asked. It's going to be a little confusing because YouTube has a little bit of a lag, so it's about 10 to 20 seconds that the stream is delayed, so I get the questions late, so we'll probably keep them for late in the presentation, but I'll do my best to answer those questions as well. Now, I do always tell people, feel free to consider us a resource. Send me an email. Sometimes takes me a little bit to respond, but send us emails. I'm more than happy to answer emails. I always tell people we are not the kind of company that will send you an invoice just because we answered a 15-minute email conversation. And in the end of the slide and in the slide decks we're sending you, there's more information about how to contact us as well. All right, with that said, let's dive into it. And let's talk about .NET at core. What is .NET today? Well, Microsoft sees it, and I think this is very accurate, as a platform for building just about anything today. With .NET, we came a little more from the traditional desktop angle with web added to it. That was the original vision of .NET 20 years ago. And that angle is still very much true today. Web development going very, very strong with the most modern version of .NET and ASP.NET being .NET Core 3.1, as we'll see. That is a very popular platform, rejuvenated the ASP.NET ecosystem. Works very well cross-platform, as we'll see. So that's going strong, probably not news to anyone. We also have the desktop angle. Now, the desktop angle is probably a little more surprising, and the thing I can report with the desktop is that we are actually seeing a little bit of an uptick in interest in desktop development. So I think what we see is, on one hand, we have a very strong setup for web development, And that is useful for a lot of things. That's kind of our default that we go to most of the times these days. And I think everybody understands how big that is. But what is interesting is that we've had a number of customers, and we hear that from authors and our community involvement and insiders list and so on. We see that a number of people are actually switching back a little bit to desktop development. And so having a good Windows desktop ecosystem with WPF, with Windows Forms and so on is also probably more important than people realize at this point. So a typical reason to go to a desktop would be if you have an application that's more like a control center that uses multiple screens, and you want to have very detailed control over where different windows appear and fine tune a lot of that stuff. So we see, interestingly enough, an uptick in interest in that as well. It's great to see that .NET covers that. We have the cloud, of course. Again, one of those topics that probably if you're in this presentation, I don't really have to tell you how important that is. And cloud means, of course, Microsoft Azure, but it also means other clouds. You're by no means pigeonholed into Azure, although Azure is a very popular choice along with the Amazon offerings. I would say those are the two big ones. And all the .NET stuff can play in that very well, be it on a Windows platform or with the new .NET Core stuff being cross-platform. So you're on a very safe path if you have chosen that. And that, of course, goes in combination with what I would call web client-side development. So just because you're building a .NET Cloud app doesn't mean you have to use a certain technology. Very often that may be ASP.NET Core on the server or for services layers. But on the client side, it may be different client-side frameworks. It may be framework-less development in the browser, or it might be something as interesting as doing .NET development in the browser, which we'll talk about today as well. And it's such an interesting topic that today is not long enough to cover it. We'll have a whole separate Stata.NET focusing on client-side development in the browser using Blazor in a future event as well. What else do we have? We have mobile, of course. Xamarin development, getting more and more integrated into regular Visual Studio development. We'll talk about that. We have the gaming side of things. Very, very interesting. Maybe not so much for us in this presentation, but certainly the gaming side is going strong. IoT is getting more and more important, being able to deploy to very small devices, sensors, even sophisticated things like AI and video recognition solutions. And that is the IoT side of things. So it's important that .NET plays very well on the small end of the scale, deploying to those devices, and that's covered really well too. And then, of course, there's AI, computer learning, deep training, computer vision, all those AI and machine learning related things. And again, .NET's a great platform for that, and a huge topic in itself, getting very important. There's fewer and fewer apps that do not have AI. So a lot of people often think about, well, why would I need AI? What would my app do? And the reality that we see in the marketplace is you can make just about any application better today with AI, whether that is smarter search, very important for business applications, whether that has to do with image recognition or integration with images, whether that has to do with smart suggestions. Even in Visual Studio, as you type code today, IntelliSense isn't just a lookup system for type information showing you completions, but IntelliSense has become a truly intelligent system that uses AI to make smart suggestions. So there's examples of that all over the place, and that's going to be a whole separate or maybe multiple Stata.NET online events right there. So that's the .NET ecosystem as Microsoft envisions it. Of course, you supplement that with non.NET technologies as well. You do in JavaScript, different client-side technologies. You may be doing mobile development in Java or Swift or something like that. And .NET plays very well on the back end for that. So where's the market at with all this? Now, the first message that I want to send is that .NET is going very strong. .NET Core is being adopted industry-wide. That was not a given when Microsoft re-envisioned .NET. So it's really good to see that. Now, that doesn't mean that the full framework, it's a little bit awkward in terms, but the .NET framework or the full framework which is the original version of the .NET framework. That's not going away. It's version 4.8 right now. It's fully supported. We'll talk about that. But in parallel, we have .NET Core, and the adoption of that is on a very, very rapid uptick, and it's very popular. It's a little bit difficult even for me to get good numbers of what the current adoption is. Something from that I got late 2019 is Microsoft reported that there was over 1 million new monthly active .NET developers. So that's significant when you think about this. Adding 1 million developers every month that are actually active. So not just people that downloaded it once and then tried it and never used it, but people that are actually active in the community. So question online is .NET going to support easier connection with appliances finally? Depends on what appliance, I guess. I'm not an appliance expert. So it depends on the device you have. And so when you talk .NET, it's mostly about what do you run on. And that certainly is really, really good. So if you have like a camera and small devices or even Raspberry Pis and things like that, it runs very well on that. Now, if you want to connect to some home appliance, it depends on what that appliance supports. But in general, the answer should be yes, the story should be much better than it was before. Okay, let's see, what other questions do we have? Okay, I think that's it for now. So let's talk about the full .NET framework. So this is a little bit, where did we come from? And I think it's important to understand. Now, some of you may already know that, so bear with me here. But we are currently on the full .NET framework, the Windows version, the thing that goes back 20 years. We are on version 4.8 of that framework. It's a very stable framework. It's a very feature-complete framework. It's a behemoth, if you want to think of it like that. Now, Microsoft decided to re-engineer that. Why? Because the original .NET framework was made for a world as we saw it 20 years ago. You had individual machines. You had maybe server boxes that were in some corner somewhere in some small data center. And you would usually install an app on that. And you would usually install the full .NET framework on that. It would just run as part of the operating system. Great for running Windows desktop apps. Great for running ASP.NET server-side apps if you have a server dedicated to that, or at least it was your server. But it also had downsides. In a modern world, we want to break things down a lot more granular. We want to pick and choose only the pieces of the framework that matter. If we run on the cloud, it's important that we are not wasteful, that we play well alongside other apps, so scaling works, so we can run the app in a way that's economically advantageous, where we don't incur too much expense. And so it's advantageous to break the app down for a number of reasons and only reuse the pieces you want. And you want to be able to run in parallel with other applications that may be running different versions of the framework, and you don't want to step on each other's toes and so on. You want to be able to deploy to containers. Okay, so that in itself is a huge reason to rethink the way the framework should work. Then on top of that, add that you potentially want to run on Linux, you want to run on mobile small devices, phones, you want to run on IoT devices and so on. So that made it necessary to rethink how .NET works. And that's why .NET Core came around. But fundamentally, if you're doing older style development, the .NET framework is fine, and it is very feature complete and a setup that works really well. And so we have version 4.8 of that. That is going to be the final version. Now, Microsoft's not going to stop supporting it. Instead, Microsoft will support this long term. There will be bug fixes. There will be security fixes. There will be stability fixes and performance things. But expect a slow update cadence. So we won't see any huge new versions of that, because we have .NET Core as the huge new version, and we'll have the next version on the horizon. We'll talk about that as well today. But you will see small updates, and you're not at a dead end with that. However, all the interesting new enhancements are going to be made on newer versions of .NET. And that means if a new API comes out that works with great new features of Windows, those changes will most likely be in .NET Core and beyond. If you are working with a new version of Windows Azure on the cloud, those SDKs and APIs will probably be available for .NET Core. Doesn't mean in most cases that you can't use them from the full framework, because very often you can just call a REST API, but the most convenient way, the most integrated way, will probably be in .NET Core. Now, one assurance that you have that the full framework doesn't go away is that it's used internally a lot at Microsoft. You have it in Office 365 and SharePoint and Bing and all those other things. So even if Microsoft wanted to stop supporting it, they clearly couldn't do it. So the big picture thus is, if you are on full framework right now, you're probably fine. You have a decision into an investment that will probably be around for a long time. However, going forward, I would recommend that you start thinking about the newer versions of .NET, and that if you create a new application, there's really not much of a reason to stick with an older version, unless some third-party components that you have to integrate with or something like that are only available on the full framework. So there's special cases where you might want to pick 4.8 for all your apps, but unless that is the case, I would recommend you go forward using .NET Core. And it probably doesn't hurt to think about, how can I change my applications right now to be more .NET Core compliant so I can move more easily. For instance, we have an in-house application that we use to run our magazine business and a few other things. And that's an old .NET full framework app. It's actually partially WinForms, partially WPF. And when we do make modifications to that, we do keep in the back of our minds that, oh, what can we do that moves well to .NET Core? Should I use Visual Basic, for instance, to move forward? Well, as we'll see later, it's probably okay, but it's probably not the best choice. So we'll add another feature, another form in C#, knowing that that'll translate into .NET easier. Okay. Now I see online there's a question about how promising Blazor is. Blazor is super promising, and we'll have a separate State of .NET event just on Blazor because it's so interesting. And I'll get to Blazor a little bit later here today. We can only do a short version of Blazor today, but it's important enough that I wanted to get it into this talk, and that we'll do another talk in the future. Okay, so what's the roadmap for .NET and the full .NET framework? It is going forward. Like I said, we've had some interesting enhancements lately, better support for high DPI displays, for instance, modern browser support, better support in all versions using UWP controls. Spoiler right here, UWP is one of those technologies that if you're thinking today whether you want to build a universal Windows app, I'm not a huge fan. We don't see a lot of work coming our way that way. We don't see a lot of customers adopting universal Windows apps and that whole UWP platform. But it is nice that you can take some of the controls, some of the fluent UI and all those things, and move them into your WPF apps, move them into your Windows apps. So that was very nice that was added. Now, a big focus with this whole .NET Framework 4.8 roadmap, and we might be almost at the end of that road, but there's still going to be tiny improvements. But the key focus is not to break anyone's app. Now, there's a lot of things in Windows or the .NET Framework that today you'd probably do a little different, but Microsoft can't change that because it will break too many people's apps. And that's a big goal of the full framework, and that's going to stay like that because you have 2+ billion installs worldwide. It's of course not something that you want to break, and so that means not changing things like side-by-side support. The .NET Framework 4.8 is pretty much what it is. So let's move ahead into today, essentially into .NET Core. Now, .NET Core, as I said, was this complete rewrite of the .NET runtime, re-envisioning what the whole thing is. There's a few angles to this that we haven't really talked about yet. You may already know this. It's an open source framework. You can find the source on GitHub, which, by the way, it's now been a while, but Microsoft purchased GitHub. GitHub is a big puzzle to Microsoft's development plan at this point. We'll probably have a separate State of .NET just on DevOps and all those things. So GitHub plays into that. And the .NET Core framework is fully available on .NET Core, on GitHub as open source. So that's an interesting angle. Not so surprising anymore today, was very surprising a few years ago. So if you haven't checked this out, that's a very cool development. Cross-platform is huge, being able to run both on Windows as well as Linux for web development on the Mac, phones, and so on. So that's a huge thing. Now, .NET Core, we are calling it a subset of the .NET framework, meaning you will see a lot of things that the .NET framework has, but not necessarily absolutely everything that was in the full .NET framework. Now, at this point, we still call it a subset, but I almost question that that is really the correct term. There's a few things that the full framework did that is not available on .NET Core. For instance, if you're building a .NET Core web app using ASP.NET doing server-side web development, then in the past you were able to use system.drawing to do image processing and create images or create line drawings, do any kind of graphics basically. That is missing from ASP.NET Core. And it probably won't be there either. There's other libraries you can use to do similar things, but by and large that's just not there. But that in the big picture is one of the few things I can think about at this point. So in general, it is very complete and we can almost scratch out that subset. And on the other side of the coin, there are a lot of features that .NET Core is gaining, especially APIs that they can talk to, that you may not have available on the full framework. So in that sense, it's actually becoming a superset of the .NET framework. It has, of course, side-by-side support, so you can run multiple apps that use different versions of the .NET Core framework, and they can be installed, they can be packaged self-contained, so they have everything they need. Of course, you can even go all the way to containers, and that's very, very important. And this, of course, like you said, is where all the new features will be added, and you can download this in its various versions today from this slightly, well, it's not so awkward to read the URL, but it's slightly awkward to say. You can download it from .net, so that's where that is. Okay, a few more questions online. One is, will an app written in .NET 4.6 on a full framework, will that work in 4.8? Yes, absolutely. You should expect very, very few problems in moving that forward. That's fully compatible, so you can probably just switch the target in the build settings, and that should just work. And there's another Blazor question, and I'll go into Blazor a little more later. We'll cover that question there as well. So here's the roadmap for the .NET Core framework. In November of 2019, so about a half a year ago, .NET Core 3.1 was released. And that was a huge release. It wasn't, in that sense, a big release over 3.0, which was in September. But it was a huge release because it kind of had everything that we wanted .NET Core 3rd generation to have. And that is the version that will enjoy long-term support. LTS is what Microsoft calls that. So long-term support means that's what's going to be supported for several years going forward. 3.0 was a general availability build. It doesn't have long-term support. In fact, it will run out in September, but that's fine because you don't need to target .NET Core 3.0. You just target 3.1 is the better system. And that's also what's pre-installed on the cloud environments and so forth. So that is where we're at right now. We have .NET Core 3.1 as the stable long-term version. In November of 2020, you start seeing a certain pattern there. It's going to be always late in the year. And it's going to be very predictable release cycles. We will see what's called .NET 5, and I'll talk a little more about .NET 5 here in a moment. .NET 5 will be another general availability release. It'll have support for, a year or 2 or 3, something like that. And then November 2021, we'll see .NET 6, 22 .NET 7, and 23 .NET 8. And as you see, one version is going to be long-term support. The other one is kind of an in-between version. And that's how it is going to work all around. Now, you'll also notice that the .NET Core label is being dropped off of these versions. And that means that's a big strategy shift. And we'll talk about that here in detail. But the big strategy is let's reunite all the flavors of .NET. So there won't be a full framework. There won't be a core. There won't be a Xamarin, a mobile, and so on. It will be just .NET 5 and beyond. So that's very, very interesting. So .NET Core 3, like I said, released in fall of 2019, or the 3.x generation of .NET Core, I should say. The major new features here were, first of all, support for desktop development. Was also enhancements in mobile around Xamarin. Was enhancements around stored procedure calls. Of course, a lot of people that make remote procedure calls. A lot of people that make remote procedure calls think of it at this point mainly as REST and JSON calls. In the past, we did other things. We did WCF, and that's still fully supported on the full framework, but not in .NET Core. And that was good if you wanted to make binary optimized calls. And it's really two different worlds clashing. It's the world of statically full typed binary optimization and the world of dynamic, very descriptive JSON types of method calls. And when you think about it, JSON works awesomely well, especially when you have a dynamic client. So that dynamic client could be JavaScript. And then, of course, it works really well because JSON essentially is native JavaScript. It even works pretty well with C# dynamic and other dynamic languages. However, if your client is a fully compiled, strongly typed, binary optimized language like .NET, say you're building a Windows application with WPF and you want to make a call to the server, to some service to get the data, now JSON may not be the most optimal. It may not be binary optimized, obviously it's not. And it may not be the most convenient to get this dynamically weakly typed thing. Maybe you want something back that's fully strongly typed and optimized. And that's what gRPC is a replacement for WCF. And as .NET on the client gains importance again, that is important as well. And there's a Code Magazine article, and you get these slide decks. We'll send those around later, and you can read that article for free. By the way, I'll point you to a few different magazine articles that we published in magazine issues. I'm not selling you on anything here. All of these ones that I'm pointing to are actually free of charge. So that's that. And then there's C#8 that's in there as well. C#8 is pretty much what you expect it to be at this point. It has a few new language features. It's optimized towards different environments that we work with. It has small detailed features. It's essentially what you expect the new C# build to be at this point, with no major new things, but fairly important details. For instance, there's some features in there that make it work or make it easier to target iOS as a platform, for instance. And then, of course, we have machine learning. We're not going to talk very much about machine learning today, other than saying it is super important. We'll have a separate state of .NET about it. And that's what that is. So a few questions online. Somebody said, is there support for web forms? No, there's not. So the person online is correct. Web forms is not supported in ASP.NET Core. So that version has been sunsetted several .NET versions ago. So if you're using that, you are unfortunately stuck on the full framework, which is also fine for now. Right, you will have that support for a long time to come, but it's not going to work that well if you're going into Azure and you are maybe expecting to deploy into Linux containers, right? Obviously, that's not supported. The new PowerUp stack, how does that impact the .NET stack is another question online. I have to admit, I'm not a PowerUp specialist. So obviously it plays together, but I'm not the person really to answer that question, but we can follow up with that after the event. I'd be happy. We are in the fortunate position to have access to people that know all that, so we can easily get you that answer as well. Now let's actually switch gears a little bit and let's just move into Visual Studio, and there's a thing or two that I would like to show you. So one thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create a new project real quick. And here's the Visual Studio 2019 new project dialog. By the way, Visual Studio 2019, if you haven't switched to that, I really recommend you do. I understand enterprise is often slow to switch and so on, but it is generally a good idea to move into this latest version of Visual Studio because there's really no pain in moving from Visual Studio 2017 or 2015 into Visual Studio 2019, and it just has all these new features like support for what I'm going to show you here right now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pick this template that I have in my recent templates list. You can also search for it in here, and that is a WinForms app. Now, many of you probably have built WinForms apps before, but notice that this is a .NET Core WinForms app. So we'll go ahead and we'll create that and stick it into my test folder. It's not going to be a very exciting app. And this just goes out and it creates a WinForms app for us. Now let's see what we can actually expect here from this. The overall experience is going to be very, very similar to the experience you would have always had when building a WinForms application, right? So here's the code it created for us. You'll see that the code is exactly like what you expect. We have our form 1 in here. We have our form1.designer file in here. And this code is the same as it always has been. You know, the code I'm showing you here right now, it's not overly exciting, but the main thing that I'm trying to drive home here is this is WinForms code, and we can go ahead and we can run this here. It's going to compile. Now the compilation process is going to be a little different because it's going to compile and target .NET Core 3.x. Okay? So it has to do a few things like restore packages and all that type of stuff. But here it is, at the end of the day, it's just a WinForms app. And this WinForms app will work the same as your WinForms app has in the past. So you could put buttons on there and so on and so forth. So what is really different here? Well, first of all, some of the things you may be calling out to. So if you are using, for instance, a file open dialog. In WinForms in the past, the file open dialog has started to look a little bit old. It's a dialog that was used years ago, and most Windows applications today have a more modern version of that dialog, but you can't get that in the full framework. If you recompile for .NET Core, automatically you're going to get some of those new things. Now, if you for some reason depended on that dialog to look exactly like it did in the past, you may have broken your app, but that's pretty unlikely for things like that. So you may have some breaking changes, but it's not going to be very dramatic. Okay, so that's kind of the point I'm trying to make there. Now let's take a look at the project itself. One of the things that we'll see is different is when we go into the dependencies, you're not going to see these local .NET Framework dependencies anymore. Instead, what you're going to see is an overall dependency into .NET Core, as well as a dependency into this WinForms SDK for .NET Core. Now, how did that come in? Well, we can actually look at the project itself. Now, if you dig into the project file, the csproj in a full framework WinForms app, you'll notice that this is a really long project file that lists every single file that you need to compile in and what to do with it. And it's kind of scary to look at in a way. But .NET Core applications are structured a little different, and the project files are actually very simple. And unlike the full framework, where we couldn't just look at the project file itself, where we'd have to unload the project and then cumbersomely go into editing the project file, here we can just look at the project file. And you see what's going on in here. So we have the output that's defined as a Windows exe. We target the .NET Core 3.1 framework here, and then it also says use Windows Forms as true, and these two things here are what brings in these two dependencies and what make this a .NET Core app. Now I could take out this WinForms reference here, and you'll notice immediately the dependency over here disappears, and now it's not using the WinForms packages, and all these framework components would now be gone. But with this in there, you'll see it reappears, and if you look very closely, it goes too fast, but you can actually see it does a package restore. So it gets all these packages from a package source like NuGet.org or your own package source and so on. So that's a huge difference. Now, how would you convert an existing Windows Forms app into this new world? Well, first of all, there's a compatibility wizard. You can run that and you can see, am I using something in my WinForms app that may not be supported on the new platform. And that may be the case. Hopefully it won't be the case. If it's not the case, then you can just go into your old WinForms app. You can right click, edit the project file or edit it with Notepad or something like that. And then you basically copy this. You get rid of everything else. You copy this in there. And that's all you need to turn it into a .NET Core app. And you don't have to list the individual files like form1 and program.cs that gets compiled into that. It just takes whatever is in this folder. And so that's the new approach in .NET Core, is everything that's in the folder gets compiled in if it makes sense and if it's not explicitly excluded. So that's how you can convert your current app into .NET Core. And the same works, by the way, in WPF. Okay, WPF, instead of using WinForms, it just says use WPF, and it brings in the WPF SDK, and then essentially it works the same way. Now, it is important to understand, and there is a question online about that as well, it's important to understand that there are a few limitations here. First of all, this is still a Windows app. When you build something like a WinForms app, it has dependencies into the Windows operating system. It uses things like GDI Plus to draw itself on the screen. WPF uses DirectX to draw itself on the screen. And those are just some examples of things that are specific to Windows when you run these apps. And what that means is, even though you're targeting .NET Core, that does not necessarily mean that everything you do is now cross-platform. This won't just work on a mobile device. And this won't just work on Linux or the Mac either. Now, will that stay that way into the future? That's unknown at this point. But right now, don't expect that you'll just recompile your WinForms app and now you have a Mac app. You do not. It's still Windows compliant. And you can think of this when you think of specific hardware. This whole not cross-platform happening automatically makes a lot of sense when you think of, for instance, IoT devices. If you use an IoT device and you access certain hardware capabilities that are only available on that device, that's not just going to automatically work cross-platform. If you're a game developer and you're using .NET to build things that are only available on the Xbox, that's not just going to work cross-platform automatically. And so when you think of it like that, it becomes more apparent why not everything in .NET automatically works cross-platform. So that's one example that falls into the same category, is WinForms and WPF development. So why then would you even do that? Well, first of all, you're moving onto a modern platform. So as you have to call, for instance, into Azure SDKs, you have a platform where those things will be available. New performance improvements, new side-by-side capabilities. You get all those things by moving to this new platform. So it's not so much that if you have a WinForms app or a WPF app, you can't live with that on the full framework. It's probably fine, but you don't want to be dead-ended. And that's why this is so important. And this ability to move to .NET Core, that means that if you have an investment into WinForms and WPF today, it is moving forward. Okay? So that's the important aspect there. And therefore, if you can move into this, I recommend that you do it. If you have an app and you run the compatibility wizard and it says you have some things that are not just going to work, think about that and over time gradually move towards that. One more limitation here that is a little disappointing at this point for a lot of people is currently Visual Basic apps do not work in that sense. So my app here is a C# application. That works fine. Visual Basic, not so much. Thankfully, there's a solution for that in the future. There will be some Visual Basic support in .NET Core. I'll have a slide on that later. But it's not going to be a really great scenario going forward. It's some backwards compatibility support. That's great. You're not going to lose your investment, but you're not going to get all these great new features either. So I do recommend that as you move forward, try to move to C# if you have Visual Basic things. It's not, I don't want to start a language war. I understand that we've been through this, but the fact of the matter is going forward, Visual Basic is kind of supported, but not that great. So that's some of the limitations. Another limitation that I have to point out here is designer support is currently limited. If you have a WinForms app and you double click this form 1 here and you expect the designer to pop up, you may find yourself disappointed because it's a little bit limited on this point. So that's going to change. A designer is available in preview. You can turn that on as experimental features. That's also going to get better going forward. In WPF, designer support is a little better at this point. Most of the time you do low-level SAML editing anyway if you build serious WPF applications, but that's a little further along. That was a little easier to support. So the designer support is coming. It's partially there, kind of in preview mode, but that's a little bit of a limitation. So we have a few more questions online. I hope I answered why you want to convert to .NET. To me, it's to core. To me, it's really about not being stuck in a dead end, and also some new features that you can take advantage of, and the world of SDKs that then becomes available for you. Somebody is asking about running Xamarin and Blazor apps on the desktop. That's a huge topic. Part of it I can't talk about yet, so take that for what it's worth. But certainly it is a big goal to run all these things cross-platform. And Blazor especially is very interesting. When you think about the fact that Microsoft acquired GitHub and GitHub owns Electron or made Electron, that means Microsoft's now the custodian of Electron apps. And when you think of an Electron app as a browser app turned desktop app, and all of a sudden with Blazor, we have these new really interesting ways of building browser apps. Well, if you then combine that into Electron, that certainly would make for a very interesting way to run .NET code as a desktop app cross-platform. So that's interesting, but that's still a little bit just on the horizon type of stuff. So let's switch back to our slide deck here. So that's our quick dip into seeing the characteristics of a WinForms desktop app. If you want to learn more about all this stuff, I want to point out a few things. We did do a special issue of Code Magazine called the Code Focus Magazine, focusing on what was at the time .NET Core 3.0, really probably should have been called 3.x. And that's a magazine that you can read through soup to nuts, and it gives you an overview, almost like a little book about all the different interesting technologies in .NET Core. It's a printed magazine. It's also available online. We are out of the print ones, but you can get access to that online at this URL, completely free, right? Again, I'm not trying to sell you on anything here. This is free. Get access to this. Also, I'll tell you about our mobile app in a little bit, and that is available as well in that mobile app, and you'll get that for free in there. A little bit older, but still very applicable, is actually our regular issue that focused on .NET Core 2.1. Again, it's also available for free online as well as in the mobile app, so check that out as well. So that's .NET Core 3. I think we talked about all of that already. So I'm going to skip through that relatively quickly. We talked about all that. ASP.NET Core 3, what's new in there? Lots of little things like the gRPC support, better native support for JSON. Microsoft moved away from JSON.NET as a third-party component. That's still available, but it's now actually integrated into ASP.NET, and then all of .NET Core is a new JSON namespace, and part of that has to do with the guy making JSON.NET now working for Microsoft, of course. Entity Framework has some new features. Again, just what you would expect, incremental improvements. We have a whole article on that as well, and we'll send you all these links and the slide decks, like I said. So a little bit of food for thought here. With what we've seen so far. .NET Core is a refresh of an aging platform. It's the one you want to be on because it's a little bit of a breaking step forward. You may see some things that break as you go to this, but it is the new platform that fixes a lot of things that are just envisioned for the new world. And so that's why you want to be of a really good way going forward, even with the desktop applications. Okay? I really wouldn't start a new version on the old framework at this point unless I had a specific reason. Another related thing, .NET Standard. .NET Standard is this thing that people think of it as a technology, but it's really not. It's really just an agreement of what is supported on what platform. because we now have different versions of .NET. We have the full framework, we have the core runtime, we have Xamarin, we have scaled down IoT version. So if you're building something, how do you know what works on all of them? And .NET Standard is this thing that compiler builders and tool builders can support to build something that works everywhere. When I build a class library, when I build a service contract, all those kinds of things, I by default build them towards .NET Standard because then I know it runs everywhere. And I am using .NET Standard 2.0. 2.1 is kind of a specialty release that requires .NET Core 3.0. It's a bigger standard that's not as widely supported. Only use it if you have a real reason to. I recommend going with .NET Standard 2.0. Okay, another related topic. This is in here so you can do a little more research on your own, but the .NET Foundation is now this open source foundation that supports .NET in various ways. Check it out. It's kind of really cool that it's more of an open standard rather than not just Microsoft. I recommend looking into that. Now going forward, let's talk about some exciting new technologies that are coming up. Number one, Microsoft Blazor. I'd love to spend 3 hours on this. We will do a full online version of the state of .NET focusing on Blazor, but just a quick version. What is Blazor? Blazor is a new web development framework. Now, right there, most people say, why another web development framework? Web development frameworks, especially JavaScript, seem to come out every week. Do we really need another one? Now, the answer is maybe. And there's no telling at this point how well this will be adopted by the community. But we do see a lot of interest, especially from people that had anything to do with Microsoft ever. And they have a huge interest in Blazor. So it has huge potential, and it really does look like there may be momentum behind it. So what is this all about? This is about running .NET in the client. Now, how could you run .NET in a web browser? That's what we're really talking about. The web browser as a rich client running full .NET code. So how does that work? Does that mean we are somehow cross-compiling into JavaScript and hoping that that works? And the answer is no. The answer is this is built on top of WebAssembly. WebAssembly is a standard that browsers have been supporting for a while. It's supported across the board, so even things like iPhone support WebAssembly in the browser. It's a binary standard to run compiled code. Now, when you think about JavaScript, JavaScript does something very similar. It takes the JavaScript code, just-in-time compiles it essentially, a little bit simplified, but it essentially does a just-in-time compilation and then executes it binary. That's why JavaScript has become very, very fast. And so there's this binary standard that runs on all the different browsers. And WebAssembly, and I'm simplifying a little bit here, but WebAssembly is the same thing, but kind of decoupled from JavaScript. It actually came from the C++ world. So a lot of the game development guys that really need a lot of performance in the browser, they use this WebAssembly standard. So they compile their C++ code to WebAssembly. Now it's essentially as good as having real compiled code on a native platform, except it works on all the different platforms. And maybe there's a few percentage points difference in how optimized it is. But in simple terms, it's binary code that can run into a browser, in a browser. And now we can have different compiler makers compile their code into WebAssembly. So there could be a Fortran or a COBOL compiler compiling the WebAssembly. Now what we are interested in is .NET compilation into WebAssembly. So what Microsoft has done is they've built another framework runtime that runs in WebAssembly, which now means we can run regular .NET code on top of WebAssembly, unchanged essentially. And that is really, really interesting because now we can run .NET code client-side, cross-platform in all the browsers. Now, the actual front end is still HTML, so you need to interop, you need to communicate from your C# code into a .NET element on the page, for instance. But you are now, instead of being stuck with JavaScript and its different derivatives like TypeScript, but now you can run any language and you have the freedom of choice and you have very, very good performance. And you have very, very good code reuse and very, very good skill reuse. And so that's exciting. That's very interesting. And I think that's reason enough to make it worth having a new framework available. So that's coming. It is available today. Switch forward a little bit. So it is available today, but in a slightly different version. When you think of this ability to run this Blazor code and run C# code and do things like respond to button clicks and put up lists of data and do all of that in Blazor and running that on the client, that is a really interesting programming model. And this model will become available to us here very, very soon. May 2020 is when Microsoft's planning, so hopefully we'll have that shortly. It's absolutely available in preview versions at this point. And it's really essentially going to become available for real in the next full .NET timeframe, .NET 5. So that's in the very near future. But it would also be very, very interesting to use that same development model without the ability to run in the client and at least write code that's done the same way. And so what you can do is you can run this Blazor code, build your Blazor applications today on .NET Core 3.x, but the code is actually executing on the server and it's communicating back and forth. In a way, that's like the old update panel in WinForms on steroids, except it's now using Signal R and it works a lot better. So that's kind of interesting, this Blazor server-side development. But where it's really interesting is the client side. And then there's a question online, would I recommend using this today? I have to be honest, we haven't. And we are waiting for that client-side version to become available as a go-live version. We have not jumped onto the run it on the server side. That to me is it's good that is available and you can switch between the two things very seamlessly. But I am far more excited about running in the client. And can you use it today? Is it stable? Yes, you can. I would wait for the real release. That's just around the corner here. But yeah, I think the overall recommendation is this is very interesting for client-side development, especially if you're already coming from the .NET backend. And now if you have these class libraries I told you about that are built in .NET Standard, absolutely those are available and you can run them unchanged. So that's Blazor. I have a few more slides in here. I knew I wouldn't have enough time, but I wanted to leave this in here so you can actually take a look at that when we send around the slide decks. But the real interesting thing will be when we do a full hour or more of Blazor, just like that. And here's just a little example of what Blazor, the framework, because it's not just running C# code, it also requires a framework that ties it all together. And this is what Blazor could look like on the client if you're using that whole framework. You can create a CS/HTML page like you have in the past. You have C# code in there. You have a button that has a click event. You have a piece of HTML bound to a variable. But when you actually click that button, it actually runs C# code, and it's not converted to JavaScript. It's actual C# code running. So here, for instance, this is a component I could have made that has a button that increments a click, and then I could have another page, and that page then uses that component at the bottom there as a counter, so you can make these .NET components that are then used everywhere. Has a little bit of a bigger one that is a survey prompt with a title and so on. Again, I don't have time to look at this in more detail today, but just a preview, and I wanted to bring this up because I do think this is a very important technology and yet another way to run .NET. Okay, so let's skip forward. You can look at that more at home. You can get started with this today. Look at blazor.net. You can download stuff from there. And now finally, let's take a brief look into the future. The future will be .NET 5. That'll be released in November of this year. As far as I heard, none of the current crisis is throwing that off. Microsoft's working hard on that, so all these schedules look to be remaining the same. So what is .NET 5? Well, it's for one, the next major release of .NET. You can think of it as .NET Core v Next. But the big thing about this is that it's going to unify all the frameworks again. And that's also one of the reasons why it was so important to move things like WPF and WinForms onto this new platform. This is also codenamed 1.NET at some point, but it's going to be called .NET 5. Why not .NET 4? Well, because it would be confusing with the full framework, so they decided to go .NET 5, and then it will keep going on with regular numbering 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. So the main idea here is, or the main goal is, to combine the best attributes of all the different runtimes. For instance, on Xamarin, the Xamarin stuff runs on the Mono runtime. The Mono runtime has some very interesting performance optimizations. Why not bring that into the overall .NET runtime? The .NET Core stuff does some good things, and then the different IoT runtimes and so on, they all have interesting things that's going to be brought together into one runtime, and then that runtime is going to run everywhere. It's going to run in Windows, it's going to run on Linux, it's going to run on the Mac, it's going to run on the mobile devices, it's going to run as Blazor, and so on. So they all get the same runtime, the same base class library. We won't have to worry so much about .NET Standard anymore. So .NET Standard is great right now in terms of moving into this, but in the future you'll just be .NET and it'll be all supported. Web app supporting multiple platforms, native compilation with the UWP technologies to compile into native output, all of that's going to be in there. So that unification is going to be the big thing. And also tool support. Right now, if you're building a .NET Core app, you can use the .NET command line. You can say, build me a new ASP.NET web app using the command line. Now you can also say, build me a new WinForms app that way. But in the future, you'll be able to say, build me a new Xamarin app. Now, does that mean that WinForms in the future will automatically run across platforms? No, that probably won't change. Microsoft hasn't made any announcements on that. They haven't ruled it out completely, but I would not bet on that at this point. But it does mean that you can think about, for desktop development, why, couldn't we make that work cross-platform? Could Blazor play into that? Could Xamarin Forms play into that? Could the SAML WPF stuff play into that? So there's certainly a lot of thinking around that for future developments. And again, there's only so much I can talk about at this point, but I can say that this is, of course, an interesting area that Microsoft is looking into so take that for what it's worth. So that's very, very interesting, that unification. And of course, running desktop applications, like I said before, we see an uptick on that. There's also a question, is that going to be, is that security driven? Yes, there's all those aspects that play into that as well. But it's also just certain types of apps can benefit from that typical desktop environment, even though we still assume HTML apps as the standard going forward. And then this gets us right back full circle with Blazor, right? Could Blazor be a very interesting environment to build just about anything? Yes, it absolutely could be. We have to see how it plays out. Will the industry take to it? But there's huge potential there, which is why a lot of us are excited about Blazor. Quick word on Visual Basic. In .NET 5, Visual Basic will be supported to some extent. It's there for backwards compatibility. It's to provide people that have made an investment into Visual Basic a path forward. Doesn't work on .NET Core 3.x, but it will work in .NET 5, and that's not too far into the future. So what can you build with this? You can build console apps, you can build class libraries. Those things can be reused, of course. You can build WinForms and WPF apps. You can build worker services, and you can build web API apps on the core platform to do a service backend. What you shouldn't expect is any of the new things. You shouldn't expect Blazor. You shouldn't expect whatever new Windows or not just Windows, but desktop technologies that are available. You shouldn't expect the ASP.NET web platform to support Visual Basic. And by the way, we also see that people are moving back a little bit more to building applications that run server-side. Because in the web world, you have two big camps. You have the server-side app, which would be something like an Amazon.com, probably still processes a lot on the server in combination with JavaScript on the client. And then you have the guys that build everything on the client with things like Angular and so on. And all those things are well supported. But we do see a little bit of a shift back again into, let's do some stuff server-side. And like the term frameworkless development pops up more and more, keeping the clients not as complex as Angular or Vue or a lot of those are, just keeping it simple. So that's an interesting development, and Visual Basic, unfortunately, is not going to be there. It's a backwards compatibility thing. Don't see that as a big strategy, but it's great that it is supported. What will happen to web forms in .NET 5 is a question online. There is unfortunately no news I can share with that. I have not heard anything about web forms being supported. There's some maybe community projects that might do that, but there's not that good an answer. So if you have an old web forms app, yeah, I don't have a silver bullet for you. You might think about starting to convert that over. Now the good news with a lot of web apps is you can kind of do it page by page, and that makes the pain a lot easier. But yeah, web forms is now, it's been, I think, well over a decade since that's been a full thing. So that's unfortunately being phased out a little bit, unless the community comes through for us. Okay, here's the download link for the preview. That's more for things that you'll have at home. And I want to just focus on a few things here real quick with some other announcements as we get to the end of this. I'm now already a little bit over time. If you have any questions around any of this, like I always say, consider us a resource. We're not going to send you a bill for answering some questions. If you're now sitting there thinking, this is all interesting, but now what do? I have this web forms app, or I have this WPF app and it has some incompatibilities. What do I do? Or I'm trying to go to the cloud, and how does that work with the setup that I currently have? Feel free to consider us a resource. We're more than happy to answer those questions. In fact, we are offering this free hour of consulting. So if you came to this event, consider yourself the holder of a little magic ticket that enables you to talk to us, and we'll set aside some time for you. We'll call it an hour. If it takes a little longer, that's fine too, just to make sure that we can help you go off in the right directions and make decisions based on your specific needs. So if you're interested in that, we'll send you some follow-up info, but look at info@codemag.com or send email to info@codemag.com and we'll hook you up with that. Another thing, I've put up a few different Code Magazine articles, a few issues that we have out. Code Magazine is now a free Microsoft benefit. You can get a full subscription, digital, as well as if you're in the US. Unfortunately, it's only in the US because otherwise it's too expensive for us to ship, unless you pay for shipping and handling. But in general, it's free for everyone who has either a Visual Studio subscription or is a Dev Essentials user using the free versions of the Microsoft tools. So if you go into your benefits page on your Microsoft homepage and your what used to be the MSDM page is now the VSS page, you will see Code Magazine in there as a free offering, and you follow that link and it gives you a coupon basically that makes it free. Now also, we've just pushed out a Code mobile app. This is hot off the presses, just been available for a few days now. We have, because of the coronavirus crisis, we have pushed the mobile app through quicker than we want. So in a way, this is kind of like a beta, but it's a very complete reading experience, completely ad-free at this point. And you can go in, and if you have any kind of subscription, during this crisis, we make all our content available for free through this app. So download the app from the Apple App Store. Android is coming, hopefully within a week or so. But get free access to this. Now you do need, for technical reasons, you do need a subscription. You can follow this link here at the bottom of the page. Easy to remember, codemag.com/subscribe/corona. Gives you a free subscription. So with that, you have a free digital subscription, which gives you access to all the magazines we've ever published during this crisis. And the free subscription is going to continue with even after the crisis. So go check that out. We appreciate feedback on it. It's a very new thing that we've did in a little bit of a rush, but we're very pleased with how it turned out. But I'm sure there's rough edges, so feedback is highly appreciated on that. Okay, also, I would like to announce our next event. If you haven't seen it yet, it's on our website. The next event in the State of .NET Online series is going to focus on Azure and Cloud, and it's going to be May 27th. So it's always kind of that last Wednesday in the month is what we're planning to do. So that's the Azure and Cloud event that's going to come up. A similar event to this, probably a bit more code than we saw today, or a lot more code. And then there's going to be future events after that. We're thinking about things like Blazor, cognitive services, DevOps, and a few other things like that. Send us feedback on what you would like to see with that as well. And with that, at the end of my presentation, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I see a few questions online. Difference, advantages of worker services over WinNT services. That has to do more with cloud type of operation. So the whole VB thing around that is making sure that you can run your stuff in worker tasks on the cloud. And then another question is, what is my view on selecting Blazor server versus Blazor client? Well, my personal opinion, and this is just me personally, but I am very excited about the Blazor on the client developments. I like the idea of creating a web app and being able to combine it with C# code. JavaScript is not as bad as a lot of people will tell you. TypeScript even a lot better. But I like the idea that I have freedom of choice between languages and that I can use C# and as many scenarios where I enjoy strong typing, and then I would love to call services that in nature are strongly typed and I just get a strongly typed object back. And there's lots of things like that I'm very excited about, and I really enjoy the thought of being able to do that. Now, doing the same thing on the server, I'm personally not nearly as excited. Before I did that, I think I'd rather do JavaScript or TypeScript code on the client. However, what is important to me is that I can build this type of Blazor style code. And if for whatever reason this WebAssembly thing isn't working out, or the running on the server is important for some reason because I have a scenario that may not support it, I can just flip a switch like this and it runs on the server and it still works. That's super exciting to me. But I wouldn't be as excited about that as my only choice because now you're basically back to this update panel type of scenario, even though I have to say it works a lot better. But that's my personal choice, and I think that at that point it comes down to just personal preference as well. Okay, we got a few other questions. One of the things that's annoying about EF Core is that you need a join entity to many relationships. Okay, so I got an entity framework question that goes into joining. I have to admit I'm not an expert in that particular topic. Be more than happy though to follow up because we do have experts in that on staff, and I don't know if there's any change in that in the recent or the upcoming versions of EF Core, but I can get to the bottom of that. Another question, what happened to Code and Zine? Zine is an older reading platform that we had. The new Code mobile app supplements that, or succeeds that, I should say. So think of it as the next version of Zine. I personally love the Zine brand that we had. I think it had a really cool logo and some really cool tech, and it was a pet project of mine. We may see some of that Zine technology or nomenclature re-emerge. Right now, Zine.com is not up and running, unfortunately, as some of you may know. We've suffered a major ransomware attack late last year. Actually, another topic that we will talk about and have presentations about. How do you recover from ransomware attacks and what happened with our attack exactly? So that may be another Stata.net topic for the future that I think will be very interesting. Just as a side note here. And that took out our whole Zine platform, and it has, honestly, I have to admit, hasn't been high priority to relaunch. We've been looking at those other things as a higher priority, but it will probably re-emerge at some point through these new mobile apps that we now have. All right, and I think that's the last of the online questions we had. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact us. I hope this was useful to people, and send us suggestions for other things you would like to hear. Other than that, thank you very much. I'll close it off at this point. We'll send you links to downloads, to recordings, and so on. And have a good day, and stay at home, be safe. We'll make it through this. Thank you very much.